Yeah, so thanks a lot for joining me on a Sunday afternoon. There's kind of two parts to talk. The first part, I want to kind of talk more generally about persona and persona in my work, and then specifically how that influenced the mural that I worked with the Hugh Lane on recently during the summer. I think there's a thread that runs through my work that's kind of gone through into this and is massively influenced by Beuys. So I think kind of everything you've been talking about over the weekend hopefully ties in with this, or I'm not making complete leaps of faith. But from the point of view of the persona, one of the interesting things around the persona is how we look at it and how we discuss the persona. So I'm just going to try and move my I can't see all of this here because of the images, but the persona is a complicated system of relationships between consciousness and society, fitting enough. Okay, I can't read all of that. Apologies for this.
Do you want me to read it out for you?
What's on the screen? I have it here. I've moved the image. It's grand.
Okay.
So Jung talked about the persona being a complicated systems of relationships between individual consciousness and society, fitting enough kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual. So I think it's been really interesting whether you buy into Jungian psychology or not. The idea of the persona has been something that has been around for an awful long time. And if you look at kind of persona within culture, the persona coming from Greek theatre and how the Greek theatre adopted masks for the actors to play different roles. So as the person changed roles, they were still the same actor, but they were playing different persona, and adding those masks and the way that those masks represented different characters has always been very fascinating for me. I think it's something that has been deeply embedded in art for an awful long time. If we look back to Picasso and how he was inspired or plagiarized or raided African art and used it as a basis for his work, and how he used kind of the assemblage of the face and the way that it was used within masks. But within each of these artists, there's a use of the mask. Like with Pussy Riot, they're using the mask both from a subversive point of view, protection point of view, an anonymity point of view, but they're also using it as a symbol of their punk aesthetic and how that has come to pass. What I love about their masks as well is that they just take normal kind of pieces of kind of long caps and then cut them out by hand. So there's kind of an extra element of that edge. And what's also really interesting around is a really interesting podcast about great women artists around the Guerrilla Girls and how they've used anonymity to be able to discuss things in a different way. One of them spoke about how she called up as herself to a gallery, and as soon as she called up later as Guerrilla Girls, they spoke to her, but before they didn't. So there's the weight of anonymity, the weight of the mask can actually separate us from being obsessed with the identity of the person or our own identity. And the same with somebody like Cindy Sherman, who has used her own face in a way in which she's represented another version of herself, but another version of self, which is effectively seeing herself, but putting on a mask of a different sort, playing characters. The image in the middle is an inspiration of mine by an artist who passed away or who died this year, called Bast. He's was a New York artist at the early kind of stages of the graffiti scene, but played an awful lot with collage and how cutting up faces and replacing faces. And I think his work to me has been really inspiring because of the way he's played with identity and played with the aesthetic of the street and the aesthetic of advertising, the aesthetic of illustration, but using this to kind of form these almost Frankenstein images. But they're very much based on the way it's been kind of graffiti and modern culture, street culture and urban culture has influenced the sense of identity and kind of hiding identity. Which then brings us on to something that is kind of closer to my background. But the balaclava is often represented within the hiding of identity within graffiti. This is an artist called Katsu, who's a tagger in New York, amazing artist doing some fascinating stuff at the moment with drones and using them to paint portraits. But he's always been a tagger, just putting his name up around the city. But obviously that sense of identity from a legal point of view is used to hide your identity. But where that has led me as an artist is suddenly thinking about, well, if you're hiding your identity, what other things is that actually beneficial for? What is that giving the artist the opportunity to play with identity and representation, and the sense of our image is being used so much over and over and over again. Like we are the most photographed generation in history. We're the most shared generation in history. The sense of our own identity is used over and over again by each one of us in a different way. We spend ages kind of positioning our cameras, making sure that they look right, or getting a light right. Or so our identity in every form of our life is now even more apparent. And unfortunately, we all have to both, at the moment, look at ourselves in this tiny little thing as we speak to other people. It's effectively like a mirror to ourselves. And on a kind of an aside, I remember reading an article a few years ago about how the invention of the mirror changed art by virtue of the fact that the artist was able to see themselves in a way that they had never seen themselves before. And that invention in of itself changed the course of art history, because it suddenly meant from that point on, people were able to actually create self-portraits, and it changed the way that we looked at ourselves. Because mirrors didn't exist before a certain point, we really had no idea of what we actually looked like in a very clear way. So that sense of identity changed. I'm not sure when the mirror was invented or when it was discovered, but that definitely changed our understanding of identity and the persona. But then jumping back to kind of talking about those balaclavas, it actually comes from a small town in Crimea, called Balaclava, during the Crimean War. And during that time, the British troops were ill-equipped with the clothing that they had. And these were patterns that you could actually buy and send out to the troops, and they gave different patterns. So the original balaclava didn't have the kind of just the eyes. It was more kind of like the central image, and then there was also kind of the helmet-shaped ones. Funnily enough, our friend, this is Joseph Beuys, as a pilot, wearing something kind of similar in the skull cap, and some of these skull caps came without the ears. There was all kind of different ways of designing them, but it's funny thinking about that origin of the balaclava coming from Crimea and him being shot down in the Crimea. But then it's been co-opted by various different people. I think in our own consciousness, balaclava is probably very, very clearly associated with Northern Ireland and with the IRA and with paramilitary organizations. And I think that symbol of the balaclava is very much a symbol of an identity that is only an identity seen through a graphic, almost a graphic image. So the image of the eyes and the mouth, or the covering of that, has formed, I think, quite a strong mental picture for us of what that sense of identity means. And I think what's interesting around Beuys and him coming to Ireland in the 1970s and doing that tour and doing the talk in the Hugh Lane, and then going up north, there's a film that I think will be shown later in the year in the gallery that Logan shared around his travels up north. There was a documentary, and he talked about talking to the students, and there was a fascinating piece though in the editorial in the magazine in the art art college. It was talking about Beuys. I know the famous artist, but Joseph Beuys never removes his, I think the word hat is missing under any circumstances. I think this is terrific. I'm at present wearing a pair of boots that I had on for 14 months, but I think there's a lot of provocations and a lot of stories written in these. But what was fascinating about him turning up in Belfast in this way is just even thinking about the persona of Beuys. He wears that I think it is a fishing jacket, or the kind of the piece. You see Beuys as an assemblage of his hat, which I think he wore as well because of some of the damage he had to his head during the war, but it became a symbol of his identity. And I think one of the things that's interesting was he was almost reducing his own personality out of that and creating another form of who Joseph Beuys the artist was, as opposed to the person. I think it's really interesting. If you I've listened to a couple of comedians talking about their onstage personas, and Stuart Lee spoke about the Stuart Lee that's on stage is the basest form of himself, not the person that you meet. But people, because he calls himself Stuart Lee as a comedian on stage, and calls himself Stuart Lee when you meet him on the street, there's a confusion around what identity really is. And I think Beuys leaned into that by actually saying, this is Joseph Beuys, but he always kind of had this fallback of looking pretty much the same every time somebody met him. And I think that sense of almost creating his own uniform or creating his own icon is really interesting in 20th century artists, of how the personality of the artist is becoming part of the art. I think Tracey Emin is fantastic in that, and that she throws herself into the work in a sense that you can't have Tracey Emin's paintings without Tracey Emin as the person and knowing her. So I think what's interesting about identity and art within for me is how that transition of understanding what we're looking at when we look at a portrait or we look at an individual, and how we create these facades that we hide behind or that we can expose ourselves with. Which leads me on to some of my own work with dealing with balaclava. So I've painted a few portraits of myself with balaclavas. This one was in Cork last year, the year before, and it has this mix of photorealism, but also this naive work, which I'll explain. This one was a piece done in Cork as well, actually, but it was me playing with the idea of being kind of, I was painting with a load of other people at the time, and who were very experienced within the graph world, and my lack of kind of experience painting at that scale, I was trying to basically take the piss out of myself by seeing myself as a learner and showing myself up. So instead of, it's almost getting the insults in first before I was exposed. But it's also kind of thinking about how we see ourselves, and this whole sense of our identity being exposed, or our identity being discovered, or our real self coming out, and how we project an identity. And we almost want to, there's a sense of destruction, there's a sense of wanting to sometimes destroy part of our own, sorry, is that playing there? Oh yeah, it is. That sense of destruction, and how we play with our own identity, and how we can play with our own identity. And this was kind of a looser piece I did in Istanbul a few years ago, which was very much playing with that sense of the thin veneer we have of skin overlapping our skulls and our core, our effectively our sense of mortality. And this was me playing with both the kind of the two sides of my own personality, or the several sides of my own personality, and my sense of kind of that, which I'll explain through another character. Which brings me back to 1974. The reason I'm going to come back to 1974 was 46 days before I was born in 74. This car bomb went off that my mum walked past with my brother in the pram, and me kind of pre-existing. It was 5 minutes before it went off. She walked past it. So if she had gone back to pick up something in Arnott's, I may not exist. And I've kind of created a fantasy around this explosion, and around this is just in city centre, just beside Trinity, and how, if I didn't exist, who would that entity be? If there were two versions of me, one who had died and one who has lived, how would the one who had lived experience the world? And it would only he or she or they would only experience the world through my eyes, through experience, but not knowing what experience was. So only through my brutal ways of explaining what the world was. It's almost explaining painting to a dead hair, I suppose. And how do you translate the real world, or your sense of identity, your sense of the experiences you have? We only exist through our experiences. So these experiences build up our own personalities and our own persona and all of these things. So without existing, we can't build that persona. And Beuys then came to Dublin and spoke about these bombings, he saw kind of his trip as in some ways a catharsis or an ability to heal or create a conversation around the Dublin Monaghan bombings. And it was interesting that he did talks all around the country and up north, and he very much embraced it and understood it as well, which was really interesting for a German artist to come in the 70s and really understand the subtleties of the situation was really powerful. And he spoke about, he had a great love for Ireland because he spoke about it as the brain of Europe, and saw it as this, I think maybe quite romanticized, but through the works of Joyce and through mythology, saw quite a romantic side of Ireland, but also saw that spirituality that I think Celticism has built up within us. So one of the blackboards have always fascinated me because of that link back to my past, but also the sense that they're a timestamp of, you don't know what happened before them. It's almost like listening to the last three notes of an opera or a symphony and trying to reconstruct that whole symphony from the last three notes. And I feel that this almost gives a sense of what our own identities are. We go through life and we meet somebody, and we can't convey everything that's inside our sense of being to that person that we just meet. So they're just grasping tiny elements, and we're all so bad at expressing ourselves in some ways that this is a constant struggle of trying to be true to ourselves and true to kind of our outward selves. But I also love the kind of the sheer abandon of his mark making in these pieces, because there's almost no thought put into the way that he's moving. He's creating these marks because he just sees them as ephemeral and as transient. And I think there's a real joy to that movement, which really inspired me from the point of view of the commission around the piece on O'Connell Street, and how that sense of mark making has always kind of been part of this character. And if you look here, this is an early mural I did, probably I'd say about 5 or 6 years ago, incorporating these two styles. So you can see kind of this element of trying to bring in this mark making mixed with the sense of identity and the balaclavas, and the balaclavas laid over each other in the sense of the eye, and trying to convey an idea of what the personality is being hidden, but also the kind of some very emotional things. You can see the car bomb represented here. You can see this character here, which I'll zoom in on, which is called Left Hand. So Left Hand is this alternative version of myself, who I see as this almost hidden character who has to understand what the world is through little glimpses of what he sees through my experiences or through me. I don't see it as a religious thing. I don't see it as a thing about the soul living on. I don't see it as something that's kind of about reincarnation. It's just an exploration on how my experiences have formed me. And by creating this character, I think I can reconstruct certain fantasies or stories or narratives that build on the work that I want to create. What's really interesting as well is they found that people who have alter egos have a greater sense of calm. I think there was a study done, I think it was in Harvard, but they talked about like people like Beyonce and Adele, how they create this character on stage and they call it something else. So by creating another character, you can actually have a release and you can be freer. I think when we all put on costumes or masks, at times we can actually feel as if we have an opportunity to do things that we wouldn't have necessarily had the bravery to do. And I think this sense of masking ourselves, and especially in a culture today in which we have so much importance on the outward looks of each other, that I think it's really interesting how we have such an opportunity to play with that and really almost take advantage of that propagation of so many images of ourselves. These are just some images from my notebooks of Left Hand, and what I even try and do is I write with my right hand. I kind of I don't know, I wouldn't call myself ambidextrous. I'm kind of just, I do some things left-handed and some things right-handed. So there's almost kind of an element of that coming through. So at times I'll draw with my left hand to kind of see how I can create these kind of very base, crude drawings. And this is actually, it's really interesting. I wrote this word persona in this notebook. A friend of mine who's an artist from Canada, a street artist, I hadn't seen him in years. I did a show with him in 2004 in the Bernard Shaw. I think it was the first show that the Bernard Shaw ever had. And he came over and we were just talking about masks, and I was talking about persona, and he was just like, you do realize persona is the Greek for mask. And it's, he explained this kind of history of where it came from. And this was kind of, this is the moment in which I kind of realized that link that I didn't actually even understand that I was creating. And these are kind of the ways of me exploring this sense of who Left Hand is, and how I can kind of use that to build work out of that. Which leads on, I suppose, to Pass Freely. So Pass Freely is a representation, obviously, of a figure. But in that mural you saw that was from a few years ago, I had painted these matches into it. They were about kind of my fascination, or as a kid, loving playing with matches and loving that kind of danger of playing with fire. And as kids, we often do that and kind of push that level of danger. But it was also about a sense of time passing. So the idea of almost like the drawings that a prisoner makes, cataloging the days, and the sense of time passing and experience has come out in this. It's funny as well, with the talk that Domino gave yesterday, her father actually drew matches within his work, and they represented an experience in his life. And it's quite interesting that there's kind of an overlap with that. I've spoken to her about it, and how the way he drew them has influenced a little bit of how I look at the way I've drawn them. Or I didn't realize I was drawing them very similarly to the way he did, but they all have their own personality. And I think the idea of a spent match is quite interesting, because an unburnt match is uniform and the same. As soon as you burn a match, it suddenly has this sense of identity. Every single one of them, every time I drew a match, it had its own tiny tweak or change that meant that they were all fascinatingly unique. So I suppose looking at the Pass Freely mural, when I was looking at how Beuys had influenced me, this book, The Secret Block for a Secret Person in Ireland, was quite fascinating how raw the drawings are in this, and how he spoke about this. And this is my notebook around the generation of thought around what I was doing with the mural. These were kind of early sketches, and just even kind of playing around with my sense of how my kind of this character Left Hand sees the world through this crude raw drawing. And I love the sense of almost trying to draw something as badly and as quickly as possible, just to try and draw it as representatively, a minimum level of representation. But almost like Picasso said, he spent his whole life trying to draw like a child. And I think that rawness and that ability is quite fascinating. And these were kind of preliminary not even drawings, but kind of mock-ups that I used to map out the mural. This is from The Secret Block. So this is where the quote came from that you see on O'Connell Street. So a childhood spent close to German folklore, which the figures of the horse, the stag, the swan, and the hare constantly come and go, figures which pass freely from one level of existence to another, which represent the incarnation of the soul, or the earthly form of spiritual beings with access to other regions. So I really like the way he talked about other regions. And I think, to me, I think Beuys probably saw it as a spiritual passage to another world. For me, I like the ambiguity of just taking this snippet of it. And when I was doing the mural, I thought what was quite interesting was people really read into so many different interpretations of this. I got a message from somebody yesterday saying her father passed away in June last year, not from COVID, but she said she actually said she had been with therapists and was kind of dealing with it. But that quote meant something quite touching to her, because there was a sense of hope and optimism. And for me, what I feel the quote represents is passing freely from a level of memory to another level of memory. And I think the Irish have a tradition of waking their dead. And that sense of waking the dead is actually, to me, an interesting way of remembering somebody. And I think the sense of festivities. I remember a grand aunt of mine who died. She was a nun and left a few hundred quid in the will so that everyone could get pissed at their funeral. And it was her sense of kind of, even though she was seen as this kind of religious symbol, she was always kind of had that spark of craziness. And I think that comes out in the sense of what we have experienced over the last 2 years with all of this death around us. And I think I didn't want it to be seen as a memorial. It certainly isn't a memorial. It's a representation of lives lived, and how each one of those people, each one of those personalities, each one of those personas could be represented in a unique way. I don't know if I'll just play through this film. Can you? Existence to another, pass freely from one level, existence freely from one level, existence freely from one level, existence freely. So for the last 10 days, I've been saying pass freely from one level of existence to another every time that I finish painting a match. That's 4,989 times that I've said it. Each match that I paint represents a person who's passed away from COVID in Ireland. The first match I painted was for my uncle who passed away last year at the start of the pandemic. I felt this was a gesture that I could make to remember him. So after each match is finished, I say the quote over and over again. So I've said it nearly 5,000 times. And I say it as an act of remembrance and a mark of respect. But a mark of respect for each person in how they've lived their lives, how they've made people laugh, made people cry, and the memory that they've left behind. Quotes from Joseph Beuys, his philosophy on art and life has always been inspiring. So when Hugh Lane asked me to do this mural, I drew inspiration from his work. So when you step back from the matches, you see that they formed a figure, and this figure on the wall is me holding my hands to the sky. And what I want this to represent is a symbol of hope, a symbol of remembrance, remembrance of all the wonderful things that these people have done in their lives and the effect that they've had on everyone around them. That's really from one level of existence to another. So I think it's interesting doing this talk. I wanted to kind of take a different step in from how I've spoken about it before. And I think even just talking about persona, for me, even though that figure is a photograph, is based on a photograph of me, I don't see it as myself. I see it as a character I'm almost deriving. In some ways similar to Cindy Sherman using her own body or using my own representation as a way to tell another story. And I think what's interesting around that is it could feel quite egotistical and self-centered, continuously painting myself. But what I actually feel is I don't really see them as myself when I paint these pieces. I see them as stories or characters that I'm projecting an idea onto. And it also kind of exposes certain maybe troubling things or things that I'm fighting with myself over and trying to bring them to the fore. So I think they're quite interesting characters that I'm pushing different identities onto. So these are some of the matches that I burnt to kind of see how they burn, and some of the early drawings of them. The wall was beautiful to paint on because it was just his raw piece, as if it literally did have its own fantastic personality. When you rip away another building from this, you can see all these remnants, these memories. Like you can see probably whiteboards, these little kind of squares on the wall of where an office was, or there's at one point there's actually a socket on the wall and a light switch that are just 16 meters up in the air, just kind of abstractly sitting there, and it's quite wonderful to see these in detail. We then mapped it out just with these little figures, sketched out the whole piece, and from the point of view of the going back to that sense of abandon that Beuys had in the way that he drew the blackboards, I practiced drawing these in studio, but then also just doing them as quickly as I possibly could. Every single one of them had a sense of energy and a sense of abandon. So each one represents a person who's died, but actually if you knew somebody who died or died from COVID, you can see them in every single match. So the representation of isn't a representation of death, it's a representation of maybe their life was lived in a full way, or they had lived until they were 90. It's not about the passage of time, but it could be a match that is burnt only a tiny bit, but they could be a 90-year-old who passed away because they didn't fulfill everything, or they hadn't spent everything that they wanted to spend, or they could have been younger and had lived a life that they were certain things or certain aspects of their life, or the way that they influenced people was more fulfilling. So I didn't want to, apart from that one first match, represent them specifically as any one individual. And this is just the finished piece. This is me and my dad looking at it, and I suppose the family link to it, and that kind of sense of how we remember and how we think of personality. It was his brother who passed away, but it's fascinatingly given an opportunity for the family, for cousins that I don't see that often, actually chatting to them an awful lot more, and how these things can bring us together. How even though it's we can see it as being such a terrible time, and it has been a time of loss, but there's also a sense of hope out of it as well, that we can remember these people, we can think of their impact on the world, but we can also try and learn from it. And these are just some close-ups. You can see here what I wanted to do was kind of, even though these are my own eyes, I feel it's kind of almost I painted them in a very muted palette. I didn't want them to look too real. I didn't want them to look too bright. I wanted to almost make them fade into the wall, and the reason for that was I wanted the matches to be the thing that people saw, the figure as a representational piece, as opposed to the figure being a representation of me. Because it completely isn't about that, but it's very much about the sense of remembrance. And that is